Today, I want to talk about the Sandokai of Sekito Kisen. And this is the next to the last chant that is discussed in Shohaku Okamura's book, um, Living by Vow. And it's actually not one that we often chant, but it does happen to be one of my favorites because we studied it when I was Shuso in 2007. And the year before, Steve and I had gone to Japan with my teacher, Grace, and Bruce was there too. And while we were staying at Rinzo Inn, which is Suzuki Roshi's home temple in Japan, we learned to chant the Sandokai in Japanese from Suzuki Roshi's son, Huitsu Roshi. Did we do that year, Bruce, or the second year? I can't actually remember. Anyway, I don't know. I think it was that year. Anyhow, and his son Huitsu Roshi is now the abbot there at Rinso Inn, and he lives there with his family. And we stayed in the temple with him for about a week, five or 6 days. And the whole trip was absolutely fascinating and wonderful. Every day was different and miraculous. We were absolutely entranced by Japan. And we were able to experience it at a more intimate level than we might have if we had planned the trip by ourselves, because Grace had been there many times. My teacher had been there many times. She spoke Japanese, at least seemed like it she did to me. And she had arranged for us to visit and stay in many fascinating inns, temples, and other places. So we learned to chant the Sandokai in Japanese with feeling, with vigor, actively. And I can only remember how to chant the title. I was the kokyo there, and this is how I had to chant the title. Sandokai, like that. And that's how you're supposed to chant. It's all like that. All the chanting that's done in formal temples in Japan is like that. You invest your whole voice, heart, and mind in each syllable. And then, so, we were just chanting the syllables because we didn't know what it meant. But later we heard the young monks, or maybe it was before, I don't remember that either, chanting at Eiheiji, which is one of the training temples in Japan. Their strong, young, masculine voices absolutely filling the temple. So anyway, not like the way we chant, kind of hanging back, not wanting to embarrass ourselves, but just really full voiced and wholeheartedly. So I didn't understand the Japanese, of course. And at first I thought, why are we doing this? But then I got caught up in the rhythm and the beauty of the sound as Hoitsu Roshi taught us, and how he taught us to enunciate. And for that matter, I didn't understand the English either. So I chose to study it as Shuso the following year as a challenge to see if I could come to understand it. Now, I did send it out with the announcement of our meeting this last week. Did anybody have a chance to read it or to print it and read it? Okay. So, but in case you didn't, I will go ahead and read it. It's a one-page poem. I'm not going to chant it like Hoitsu did. I'm just going to read it. Okay. The Sandokai of Sekito Kisen. Sekito Kisen is the writer, and I'll say a little bit more about him later. The mind of the great sage of India was conveyed intimately from west to east. There are differences in human personality. Some are clever and some are not. The teachers of the North and South are but different expressions of the same reality. The spiritual source shines clearly in the light. Branching streams flow in the darkness. To be attached to things, this is delusion, but just to understand that all is one is not enough. Each and all the elements of the subjective and objective spheres are interdependent and at the same time independent, related, though each thing keeps its own place. Form makes the character and appearance different. Pleasure and suffering appear unrelated. The dark makes all forms one. In brightness, dualistic distinctions become apparent. The four elements return to their nature like a child to its mother. Fire is hot, wind moves, water is wet, earth hard. Eyes see, ears hear, the nose smells, the tongue tastes salt and sour. Each is independent of the other, but the different leaves come from the same root. The words high and low are used relatively. Within the light there is darkness, but do not be attached to that darkness. Within the darkness there is light, but do not be caught by that light. Light and darkness are a pair, like the foot before and the foot behind in walking. Each thing has its intrinsic value and is related to everything else in function and position. Ordinary life fits the absolute as a box and its lid. The absolute works together with the relative like two arrows meeting in midair. Reading the above lines, you should have grasped the great reality. Do not set up your own standards. If you do not see the way, you do not see it, though you are actually walking on it. When you walk the way, it is not near, it is not far. If you are deluded, you are mountains and rivers away from it. I say respectfully to those who seek the way, do not vainly pass through shadows, sunshine and shadows. So when I first heard this, just in general, I thought it might be a kind of mirror image of the Heart Sutra, because it seemed to be accepting of form, where the Heart Sutra emphasizes the negation of form in emptiness. So let's see if that's true. First of all, the title, Sandokai, 3 syllables. Okamura's translation of the title is the merging of difference and equality. San, meaning difference, phenomena, form, and the relative. Do, meaning sameness, equality, emptiness, the absolute. And kai, meaning agreement, merging, or promise. So both aspects of our life, the concrete, composed of situations, ideas, evaluations, and things, and the absolute, universality, emptiness, or non-discrimination, both aspects. The Sandokai is about how these two aspects interrelate to form our life. And, thinking and writing about this made it so clear how dualistic our language is. We can hardly express an idea of unity without expressing duality. And our vocabulary kind of limits our thinking and understanding. Even words like merge and interrelate imply a duality. And maybe that's okay, but we have to remember that the implication is there. That even when we say unity, the implication of difference is there. And maybe when we say difference, we need to remember that the implication of unity is always there, also there. And so as a sideline, like the Heart Sutra, there's a lot of history embedded in the Sandokai, and I won't go into it in detail, but if you're interested, the chapter from Okamura talks about it quite a lot. So just going to the first paragraph, the mind of the great sage of India was conveyed intimately from west to east. So that the mind of the great sage of India is Buddha mind, the mind of Buddha, that's transmitted from teacher to student, but also which we experience in Zazen. was conveyed intimately from west to east, and so intimately describes that person-to-person transmission that's so important in Buddhist history and experience, and very important in also, of course, in Zen, from west to east. And this is talking about that the fact that Buddhism came to Japan via China, moving eastward across China to Japan through this person-to-person transmission. And we know that because it was tracked via extensive records that many of which we still have, because the Chinese were and always have been very good record keepers. And also, so the next line, there are differences in human personalities. Some are clever and some are not. And this really means that from teacher to student, the teaching was given and received by people of differing personalities, abilities, education, and interests. Clever, whether you think they're really intelligent or well-educated or not, was not important. And the Sandokai was written in the 8th century when Zen had actually divided into several schools, the principal ones being the so-called Northern School and the so-called Southern School. And again, I won't go into detail about what they each taught. But it seems that Sekito wrote the Sandokai in part to refute any fundamental differences between these two schools, because both derived from the same source, the mind of the great sage of India, and which is the fundamental realization beyond factions, the two differing schools suiting different personalities. And maybe this is in part an explanation why Buddhism is so diffuse in the world and has different appearances and different practices often, but always refers back to the same basic practices and teachings. And then there's the philosophical side of the Sandokai, elaborating on the concept of one mind comprising two aspects of life, the phenomenal and the absolute. And really emphasizing that these two aspects are mutually inclusive. They completely interpenetrate one another. Samsara and nirvana, these two aspects of one mind are both embodied in each individual life. To help us understand this, Okamura uses the example of the hand. Each finger is separate, and the thumb, and has a different function, but they work together to make the hand. They're both separate and completely connected. With that background, we'll move to the second stanza. So the spiritual source shines clearly in the light, and branching streams flow in the darkness. And at first, this makes it sound like the spiritual source is the light, and branching streams are the darkness. The spiritual source being the absolute, and branching streams being the relative. But actually, Sekito flips that, as we'll see. But then he says let's see what I wrote about that. Yeah. So then we're going to go back to, now we go flip down to the very bottom of that stanza. The dark makes all forms one. In brightness, dualistic distinctions become apparent. So what he's saying there is that the spiritual source of oneness is the dark, and separation of the branching streams is the light. And so really what the first two lines mean is that the spiritual source, the dark, shines in the light, and the light shines in the darkness. The branching streams shine forth in the darkness. So he's saying a very subtle point in these first two lines. And then he goes on to say, let's see, I don't want to lose my place in my notes. So then he goes on to say, to be attached to things, this is delusion. So to be attached to the light, this is delusion. It's kind of the opposite of the way we usually think, because we think of enlightenment as realization. But just to understand that all is one is not enough. So basically, I think we all understand that being attached is not enough, but that also blissing out in samadhi is not enough. Neither individuality nor unity by themselves are enlightenment. So the next lines, each and all the elements of the subjective and objective spheres are interdependent and at the same time independent. So it's both and this refers directly back to the 5 skandhas and that we studied in the Heart Sutra, and the 6 senses and their objects and how they depend on each other, and they don't exist without each other. They're both independent and interdependent. So you can't really have senses without objects of sensual apprehension, and you can't really have objects without senses with which to perceive them. So they're absolutely interdependent, but they're also separate and can be separately named and have separate functions. So they're both dependent, and they can't exist without each other, both dependent and independent. And Okamura suggests that this is a reference to the middle way, sacrificing neither the individual nor the totality. And we actualize this in Zazen when we just sit and let go of thought and are not moved. And thus it becomes an experience that is beyond words. So, and I think that the rest of this stanza pretty much says the same, the same thing. They're related, though each thing keeps its own place. Form makes the character and appearance different, and it looks as though pleasure and suffering are unrelated. That's what form does. But in fact, they are not unrelated from the standpoint of the absolute. So then moving on to the 3rd stanza, let's see. So this part says the 4 elements return to their nature like a child to its mother. And this is of course, referring to the classical 4 elements, fire, air, water, and earth. But in this context, fire it refers to the body and how these 4 elements are expressed in our own body. And so fire refers to bodily heat, wind to the breath, water to bodily fluids, earth to solid bodily parts like bones, nails, and hair. And these all merge to be an individual person, as naturally as a child runs to her mother, but is also, in a sense, as inexplicably deeply. And I was thinking, what constitutes the human person, the body, just the body? Maybe you could say the body, heart, and mind, if the mind is connected to the brain. And so if you try to think down exactly what we're all made of, and we think, okay, we're made of bodily parts, organs are made of cells, and each cell has its own constituents that we now can actually name, DNA, RNA, and those are all made up of atoms, and atoms that we can actually name what constitutes them, including, and more than anything, emptiness, nothingness. everything that's in an atom is surrounded by nothing. So how does that all work together? But it does. It does. It all does work together. So all of these things that we can name merge in some kind of ineffable way to constitute each individual. And each individual works in some ineffable way to relate to every single thing in the universe at all times. However, we each have our separate functions, and they work together the same way that feet work to walk, to enable us to walk. Just feet walking form and function one. So let's see. So as I say, each is independent of the other, but the different leaves come from the same root. And this is a reference to the Tao. Also, another bit of history is contained in this. That because Taoism had a very strong influence as it moved from west to east across China, it had a very strong influence on Buddhist thought throughout China. And here's a little, to elucidate this, here is a little quote from the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. So let's see, I have to get the right page for this. Here we go. Return is the movement of the Tao. Yielding is the way of the Tao. All things are born of being. Being is born of non-being. The Tao is nowhere to be found, yet it nourishes and completes all things. So, so again, there is this this containing a deep philosophical history that has become part of our practice of Zen. So after this section, again, he says the words high and low are used relatively. So he's not making a distinction of there's one idea that's better than another, but these are the way that we think of ideas in relative sense, but they all refer back to the same source. The next part talks about within the light there is darkness, but do not be attached. So this is another admonition about not being attached to either side of this equation. Within the darkness there is light, but do not be caught by that light. Light and darkness are a pair, like the foot before and foot behind in walking. Each thing has its intrinsic value and is related to everything else in function and position. And then he uses two more metaphors, the box and the lid fitting. Ordinary life fits the absolute as a box and its lid, just coming together naturally without any particular effort. The absolute works together with the relative like two arrows meeting in midair. And this is a reference back to a famous story of two archery masters who were so skilled that they could shoot such that their arrows would meet in midair with great ease and simplicity. This last stanza is a kind of I see it as a kind of challenge. So it starts out saying, reading the above lines, you should have grasped the great reality. Do not set up your own standards. And I when I first heard this, I thought, this is really, it sounds kind of shaming, but I don't think it's meant that way. I've decided to see it a different way. It's a challenge given to help and support us to understand and live and practice our lives in a different way. I think it's actually meant to be encouragement. Sekito is saying, I'm trying to help you get it. Read it again and try to see it. But if you don't see it, it's still there. So don't really worry about it. It's right there under you, under your feet, supporting you both near and far, and it always will be wherever you go. If you're caught in samsara, you can't see it, and it seems far away and impossible. So I think that's what he's saying when he says, if you do not see, when you walk the way, it is not near, it is not far. It seems far away or impossible, but it's really both. It's both far and near at the same time. There's a saying in our tradition. Okay, the next line is, if you're deluded, you are mountains and rivers away from it. And there's a saying in our tradition about how we move through practice. First, it's said, there are mountains and rivers. Then there are no mountains and rivers. And then there are mountains and rivers again. So then what I think that means is, first there is form. And then when we study for a while, okay, we see, okay, there's emptiness, or maybe there's emptiness. And then when we study and practice a while longer, we see that there's both form and emptiness. So that's when their mountains come back. But they come back absolutely transformed, as our life is transformed by this practice. So I think there's an implied encouragement for practice in this line. When delusions become dharma gates, there are mountains and rivers again, right here, right where they've always been, but different, dark and light together. And I came across a quote from Taigen Leighton, who's a living Zen master, a student of Suzuki Roshi's. The sage has no self, yet there is nothing that is not herself or himself. The sage has no self, yet there is nothing that is not herself or himself. And lastly, these last two lines, I say respectfully to those who seek the way, do not vainly pass through sunshine and shadows. And this recalls very much to me, and I think it probably is related to what our evening gata, a chant that's done at the end of the day at Zen temples. And also, this is inscribed on the han, which is a piece of wood, raw wood, and which is struck to announce the time for zazen every day at a Zen temple. We have a han. I haven't inscribed it, and was going to put it up at our little Zendo in Oakhurst for our practice period that we were going to have in person. So it's waiting in our garage, and maybe we'll be able to use it someday. But this is what it will say. And this is a translation of the gata, and gatas are little spontaneous poems that express a deep feeling and deep experience of life. And so this is the traditional evening gata. Let me respectfully remind you, life and death are of supreme importance. Time passes swiftly and opportunity is lost. Let us awaken, awaken. Do not squander your life.